Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the November Pests in Progress webinar. My name is Jackie Pohl, and I'm the communications person for the North Central IPM Center. We are one of 4 regional IPM centers supported by USDA NIFA's Crop Protection and Pest Management Regional Coordination Program. Our mission is to coordinate IPM across the region by sharing and promoting IPM research, extension, and teaching activities. Today, I anticipate that there may be a number of questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gretchen Paluch, Pesticide Bureau Chief at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. She will share new pesticide mitigations, labels, and bulletins. Oh my. Welcome, Gretchen.
Good afternoon to everyone. Before I start, I want to make sure, can I get a signal that my audio is coming through okay?
Yep, you're good.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, before I get into the slide set, I do want to take a moment to recognize and thank the folks at Iowa State University, and in particular their extension group, because they're the reason why I received the invitation today, and I'm really excited to be able to share some information with you. Information really that is coming from experiences and perspectives that I've gained working for the state lead agency in Iowa, and that's the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And these are perspectives really from the past 2 years working in pesticide regulatory programs. We work very closely with our pesticide safety education professionals that we have in the state. And again, that's another call out and thank you to Iowa State University. I also want to mention that we also work very closely with the pollinator working group at Iowa State. So that's where a lot of this information and experience is coming from. And probably one more group I want to acknowledge before I get into the slide deck is the Association of American Pesticide Control Officials. I also participate as part of that association and have been active for several years now. And that association also is a reason why I'm able to bring some of the information to you today. So I can go ahead and get started then. After thanking those groups and all of their support and help, I'd really like to share some of the thoughts and experiences we're seeing related to Endangered Species Act, and kind of want to start there today. In that Endangered Species Act was established in 1973, and it was established for the protections of fish, wildlife, plants, and that are listed as threatened or endangered species. And this is an act that is administered by the services. So that is why on a number of the different maps that you see and different websites, you will see references to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as no marine fisheries. And you can see a map here on this slide that refers to some of the species range densities. And this is for listed species in the U.S. and get a sense of where some of those species are located. So this is a very important act that was put forth. And it does require that federal agencies ensure that actions that they take will not jeopardize the continued existence of listed species or result in adverse modification of that species' critical habitat. And how this plays into pesticide regulatory programs and with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is this does require EPA as part of their pesticide programs to look at those impacts, and it applies in pesticide new registrations as well as registration review. Those are the types of actions in which this does come up. And thinking back to really the intent of the act and what work EPA, the federal agency, is doing, it does make sense that pesticides are a part of this, because pesticides can be a stressor, can be a chemical stressor. They can be one of the factors that are relevant that could result in jeopardy or adverse modification to listed species or their habitat. But there are other factors that can do that as well. Pesticides are one potential factor. Habitat loss can be another component, climate change, invasive species, pests, disease. There are other factors to take into account as well. Pesticides are one of those stressors. So it does make sense that this is something that federal agencies, EPA, would take into account. Now, looking into more details under the Endangered Species Act, you will find that there is this may affect standard. So what that means is that if a pesticide may affect a listed species, EPA would look forward to consulting with the services in a traditional sense. The consultation can take time. Looking back over the years, there are different projections on how long some of those consultations have taken. What this means is that these are lengthy processes. The ability to apply them to all of the new pesticide registration and registration reviews that take place, it does start to, one does start to see why there can be a backlog and there can be a constraint on resources. So that's where this has come up recently. So it's important to look at really how this process is working, look at what can be done in the future and why this is a topic here and now. And the reason why is because it's unreasonable for listed species to wait. I think that's really why a lot of people are recognizing this is something that needs to be looked at, needs to be addressed now, because it is unreasonable for species to wait. And from that standpoint, if folks are listening to this webinar and are interested in what species are listed in their area, I do want to highlight that there are places you can go to get some of that information, to become more informed. And I can share experiences from where our state is located, what we've looked at. And I want to do that for a second because I think it's important to recognize and become familiar with what species we're talking about and why it's important to look at ESA and how it impacts EPA and federal agencies. I do have a website posted on this site that looks at some of those listings for fish and wildlife. And I do want to go a little bit deeper into the Iowa story, and that Iowa has 19 species that are listed. And I do want to also provide a little bit of a story and an experience where it was probably a few weeks ago when I was working with some of our university extension staff looking at our pollinator working group. And it was interesting. Right after we had a discussion on Endangered Species Act and really what impacts there are in pesticide programs, not even a week later, we saw news stories come out in Iowa. So these are recent. This actually just started coming out in early November. So this is a real current, topic, even in our state, in Iowa. And one of our listed species is the rusty patch bumblebee. And it was interesting because we started seeing these stories pop up. Basically, someone who was working for the county, an educational specialist working for Johnson County, basically figured out that they had a rusty patch bumblebee nest at their place. And they took a picture and then posted it to iNaturalist, got in contact with researchers, and researchers came out and they looked at the nest. And after the rusty patch bumblebee had gone through its life cycle, they were actually able to excavate that nest and do some studies looking at the nest ecology, microclimate, really looking at understanding that species more, and really how can we learn, how can we adjust and combat against some of those species decline issues, and really try to address that. Because going back, there's more than just chemical stressors in the environment. There's a lot more to learn about these species. But one point I do want to make is that it's important in order to do what we can to protect species. And this is a very, very current situation, and it does hit home if you go and look at the species that are in your state or in your region. One thing I also want to mention is that in sharing some of the perspectives that we've heard at some of the state agencies, talking about endangered species and pesticides is not a new topic. It's actually something that has been talked about for quite a while. And I do want to give an example of that. I remember when I was a graduate student, as part of our program, we would participate with the American Chemical Society and the Agrochemical Division. And going back in time, obviously, when I was in grad school, I remember going to some of those ACS meetings, and there would be presentations made about how courts were starting to have impacts on pesticide use and pesticide registration decisions. So what I'm showing you is a slide set, or a slide that Dr. Alan Felsett put together, and he presented some component of this at an agrochemical division presentation some time ago. But this slide set is at least 9 years old. So this is old information. This is a topic that has been talked about for some time out in the Pacific Northwest, especially. But looking at how courts were impacting pesticide use and FIFRA decisions is not a new topic, is the point I want to make. And it's something that has been a perspective that's been out there for some time. And one of the ones that I remember hearing about, and it's here on the slide from Dr. Felsett's presentation, is basically an omen for the future in looking at really what sort of impact some of these court decisions have, looking at FIFRA adequacies to address environmental concerns. It's something that has come up. And fast forward to current day, this is still being talked about. There are still news stories and perspectives out there looking at really what implications there are for federal agencies on their interpretations related to some of these registration decisions and different decisions that federal agencies are making. And where does this lead us? Basically, this leads us to a point in time where there are types of uncertainty that are coming into play, that are being introduced. And I think it's good to take a moment and reflect on this. These are just perspectives that I'm sharing at the moment, and different ones that are out in the news. You can take your pick of your favorite news outlet and read different perspectives out there on this. But coming back around, you can look at really who's impacted, consider who's impacted by some of this uncertainty. And when it comes to pesticide use, there's quite a bit at stake, because there's a lot of different groups that utilize pesticides and rely on pesticides. And for very different purposes, I might add. This is not just an issue that's impacting one industry sector or one group. There are examples of entities that rely on pesticide tools for controlling disease vectors. I think about mosquito control programs and trying to manage disease outbreaks. Very important to have pesticides as a tool to use in those types of situations. There are also groups that spend a lot of time working in conservation, habitat restoration. Those groups also rely on pesticides as a tool in order to achieve the results and these restoration goals set. The food supply. I think agriculture is another sector considered. They very much rely on pesticides as tools in order to do what they do. Managing invasive species. That a variety of groups rely on pesticides for different purposes, different types of pesticides, and there is an importance to this. So having uncertainty within the process is not something that really lends itself well to the future of pesticides and use in the US. And so that's something that's very important when considering all of these discussions going on related to endangered species, because there's been a fair amount of litigation on this. And if you're interested in what the history is, the different cases that have been talked about and outcomes, guess what? There is a website. EPA has put together a website that can summarize a lot of this information. You can actually access some of those decisions on their website, and you can see these listed here as well. And when you start to scan through some of these, it becomes even more apparent that we're not just talking about one pesticide product or a few. You're talking about a lot of pesticide active ingredients. There's a lot of litigation around this. There's also more than one species, more than one listed species that was involved in a lot of these cases. So this is a big issue. It's something that has basically increased over time. And there is a historical perspective on that. Also considering that with all of that history, the work that's being done, or more recently being done in 2022, was not the first work to be done on trying to come up with a plan to protect endangered or listed species. Back in 2002, EPA published an approach for field implementation of their ESPP. So that's their Endangered Species Protection Program. And one of the things to consider as part of those efforts, again, going back in time, is something that we hear about today, and that's Bulletins Lives. So Bulletins Live 2, that website, and the idea of using a bulletin that's tied to a pesticide label, that's not a new idea. That is something that's been out there for some time and in practice. Thinking about some of the different pesticide use that we see in the Midwest, we may not all be in region or specific areas that have utilized pesticide bulletins, but it's important to recognize that that's not new. That is something that has been on pesticide labels before. What did start to come out in 2022 is a new work plan. Basically, EPA put together a vision as part of a work plan to look at addressing a lot of the components of these different lawsuits that they were facing. And they were looking to do this in a more comprehensive manner. It set forth a vision, and it did look at basically look at what changes could take place as part of those agency decisions to look at new compliance requirements for applicators and really putting forth additional protections for species. Now, the first work plan came out in early 2022. There was a work plan that EPA released in late 2022. So there are two different versions of that. There are a number of different strategy documents that EPA has been releasing and finalizing, and this is just a timeline to give you some idea. It also gives you a good sense of when some of those actions were, or when some of those activities and strategies were released, and really the time frame over the last 2 years, a little 2.5 years probably. There's been a lot of work that has been put forth and a lot of documents released. In looking at these different strategy documents that you might hear about at different points in time, different versions of them, whether they're a final strategy or a draft strategy, you can go and access these. And I'll have a link a little bit later in the presentation where if you are interested in reading these, you can find them. But I think it's good to acknowledge that this is work that has been done really over the last 2.5 years. There's a lot of different documents that have been released. There's a lot of effort that's been put into designing protections for listed species and their habitat. And there's more to come. There are more strategy documents that are coming up after the herbicide strategy. We're looking for a final insecticide strategy. We're looking for a draft fungicide strategy. So if you want to see some of that information in another format, this is a table that was put together as part of a work group I had mentioned earlier. I participate with a states association, and that's APCO. They have a work group that has coordinated and even have some industry representation that helped put this together and really tried to organize the different type of strategy documents that were under development, different stages of BIOPs that are being worked on as well, and pilot projects, and to provide some timeline for each one of those. So this is just a snapshot of the different things that have been going on related to some of those ESA strategy documents and efforts that EPA has been putting forth. And when I look at this table, I think, first of all, wow, that's a lot of work. EPA has been very, very busy and a lot of effort, and I don't think it should go unnoticed how much effort the agency has put into addressing protections for endangered species. Also, when I look at this table, I look at some of the timelines, and I look at the amount of public comment periods that have taken place with all of these different efforts. a substantial amount of public comment has taken place with these documents. So there's also an incredible amount of involvement. And there is more to come. Again, I've got a highlight in here really to look at what are some of the upcoming strategy documents. And that gives you an idea of what to look for if this is something that you want to provide comments for or understand and look at more closely. So with that, after recognizing how much work has gone into this and considering that it's not just a one-size-fits-all strategy, EPA has looked at different groupings of pesticides. So herbicides, forming a strategy specific to herbicides, forming a strategy specific to insecticides. There has been some grouping in terms of how to address these different types of pesticide products. What I'd like to do is I'd like to provide some highlights related to some of the strategies that have been released so far. And I'm not going to go into detail on each one of them, certainly not. That would take a very long webinar. But I do want to provide some high-level points about what we're seeing in some of these strategy documents moving forward. But an incredible amount of work by the agency, no doubt. One thing that these strategies are putting forth is they do offer a framework. I think that that's important to recognize. A framework does help us, does help with seeing that there is consistency that's being applied as part of these strategies. It does allow for some consideration of what's reasonable to being worked into that framework, that format. There is transparency with some of that approach to look at potential impacts and identify mitigations, and also what reductions and protections for listed species and their habitats we're looking at. So this framework does provide a lot of good information and offer some advantages, and something that we're seeing as part of these different strategy documents. I have a picture here of the framework that's being applied as part of the herbicide strategy. And really that starts out really, well, it goes through three main steps, really. It's looking at population impacts. So if there's an impact and understanding how the impact is there, going into the different types of mitigation. So what kind of practices, considering what practices could have impacts on mitigating some of the impacts to the population is kind of the second step. And then thirdly, looking at really the spatial component, the geographic extent of some of those mitigations, looking at where some of that mitigation would apply is another component of those strategies. And keeping in mind that this framework is something that's being proposed to be implemented as part of registration of new pesticide products and registration review. These strategy documents are not being proposed as self-implementing. They are something that we are going to see the outcome of them being applied as products go through those agency actions. So I think that's another important component. There is a framework with these. And then what I plan to do is go through a couple of other highlights related to these strategy documents. This is the framework. I'd also like to look at another component that EPA integrated, and that's the Vulnerable Species Action Plan. The Vulnerable Species Action Plan is one that really introduced some specificity for species that EPA had looked at and are identified as specific taxa that they wanted to provide protections for. And there were 27 that were listed in this Vulnerable Species Action Plan. And this is where some of that early specificity is being incorporated into that registration process that's being proposed. And this is something that we will continue to see play out when a lot of the maps that EPA is working with are finalized. But these are more specific protections. EPA is talking about more specific protections for these specific species. This is where specificity is coming into some of these strategy documents. And it will be rolled out as part of EPA's registration of new products and registration review. In addition to a framework and species specificity, certain listed species, EPA is also proposed as part of their strategies to provide more broad mitigations and these are referred to as FIFRA, Interim Ecological Mitigations. So FIFRA IEMs is usually how I hear these referred to. And these are broader mitigations that are to be applied across all the products in the groupings. And these are ones that would show up on the pesticide label. So these FIFRA IEMs are not ones that would be identified in geographic specific locations. These are more broad mitigations. We did see these described in more detail as part of Herbicide Strategy. They were first, place where we saw them first was really in some of the ESA work plans and the updates, especially started to talk about these FIFRA IEMs. And these are intended for agricultural crop uses. So it's something to note that at this time, these are mitigations that we're expecting to see on pesticide labels for ag crop uses. These are separate from additional mitigations that one might see as part of a bulletin, which is different. And I'll talk about that in a little bit in a couple more slides. These are broader mitigations. And it does represent some changes to what we've seen in pesticide labels in the past. And the reason why we say it's a change in that EPA is focusing on two areas in which they're looking to identify specific mitigations. And those do include a reference to spray drift mitigation and runoff and erosion mitigations. And it's the runoff and runoff and erosion mitigations where we are starting to see conservation practices show up and be requirements for use of pesticide products. Now, there are options for these, and we'll go ahead into more detail on how a pesticide user would encounter these and what to watch for and what options that they have. But keep in mind, these FIFRA IEMs are looking to be applied in two main categories. One of the categories with additional spray drift mitigations. A lot of those are going to focus on windbreaks and spray drift buffer requirements. You will start to see those. The runoff and erosion mitigations are ones that are going to reference more of the practices that we see as conservation practices, and that's where some other tools are going to be available. In looking at runoff and erosion, EPA has taken into consideration the differences in runoff vulnerability across the U.S. This is a picture from EPA's website on mitigation measures, and you can access this. I'll have the website here in the next slide. But basically what this shows is it shows that EPA is taking into account runoff vulnerability in different areas of the country. And if you look at the map, you can see where you are in reference to where some of that runoff vulnerability potential might be. And this is going to play out in terms of how many relief points you receive, or really how much flexibility you're going to have with some of the mitigation measures and looking at some of these newer labels. So let's take a look at what some of those runoff and erosion mitigation measures are. This is a listing that I did take from EPA's mitigation menu website. And I think it's important to note that EPA is continually looking at mitigation measures, and you might see some changes in terms of how many different options are listed on this website from time to time. It's my understanding this website is something that EPA will be updating. So there may be more measures added as EPA is able to determine that these meet basically their criteria and standards in order for reducing runoff and erosion potential. But there are different mitigations that are on there at this point in time. And this is something that pesticide users will need to go and look at this website and determine whether or not they need to apply any of those measures. The second category of mitigation measures that EPA identified are ones to reduce drift. And this is also something that we're going to see listed on the pesticide label as EPA applies these different strategies. The strategies for drift, many of them, we know general goals and ways that drift have been reduced, reduction in rate, droplet size, boom height, the amount of product applied to fields. But some of the newer ones that folks may not be as familiar with or have seen on past labels involve standards for windbreaks, hedgerows, forest habitats, and then also buffers. So we're going to be looking at these as they start to appear on pesticide labels, and you may see some adjustments and use requirements there in order to implement some of these protections for listed species through the strategies. Now, I did mention EPA's mitigation menu website when I was referring to the runoff and soil erosion mitigation measures. What you will see is on pesticide labels, there will be a reference to this runoff and erosion website that EPA maintains. You can see a snapshot of that website over on the right side of the screen, and there is a listing of what the practice is. And then also on the far side of the screen, you'll see there's a number for how many points each mitigation relief option provides you. And so what applicators will be looking for is a total number of points, accumulation of points for a particular field, and ensuring that that accumulation at least meets the requirement on the pesticide label. So you might have to apply 1, 2, 3, basically a combination of different mitigation relief options in order to meet the point requirement to use a pesticide product. Now, what that's going to mean is that pesticide users will have to total those points. They'll also have to make decisions about what points to use. EPA has developed a tool, and they have this available on the website as well. They refer to it as EPA's runoff points calculator, and it's a Microsoft Excel file, and you can open it and go through the different windows to determine really if you have a particular measure implemented on your field or not, and how many points that's worth. And then the worksheet will calculate how many points you have cumulative as part of that. So there are some tools that are available that EPA has put out there, and this website tool, the calculator, and the directions on the pesticide label that outline runoff requirements as well as pesticide drift requirements. Those are some of the more broad FIFRA IEMs that we're going to start seeing on pesticide labels. Remember, I had mentioned with these strategies, there's going to be multiple components implemented. There's the framework that we talked about. There are these species-specific measures that we're going to see come out as part of vulnerable species action plan. Then we have these broad FIFRA IEMs that are also going to be coming out as well. There's another component to watch for as part of these strategies and as these are implemented. And those speak more to the geographic specific areas of the U.S. where the listed species in the critical habitat are located. And those are coming out as part of bulletins. Now, I had mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation that the idea of having an endangered species protection bulletin is not a new idea. This is a website, and this is a format having a reference to a pesticide bulletin on a pesticide label is something that has been in place for some time. If folks are listening to this and you've ever used a pesticide product that was labeled for over-the-top use on dicamba, it's possible you could have had a bulletin tied to that. There are sections of Iowa that do have a bulletin if folks were using dicamba over-the-top use products. So this is something that has been out there and in practice. But I do think it's fair to say that given the number of different pesticide products that these strategies will be impacting through registration review or new active ingredients registration, there are likely going to be more of these product labels that carry these mitigations, and also there's going to be more use of this bulletin website. So it's not just going to be a few products. It's going to increase if this is utilized for all of these agency actions. So get used to Bulletins Live. Bulletins Live is going to be something that's going to be a part of reading the label and following those use directions. At this point, the label requirements read that applicators have to, or I should say pesticide users have to obtain these bulletins and access the bulletins within 6 months of the days of application. And the way that one would use one of these is they would look at inputting their location, their site location, and then they can input the pesticide product information into the Bulletins Live 2 website. And then they're provided with something that you see on the screen here. And this is what the Bulletins Live 2 website displays. It will tell you if there is a pesticide with a bulletin at that location. And I've got a screenshot here. This is really covering the state of Iowa to take a look at the different pesticide bulletins that we have in the state right now. And there are 2 bulletins that I'm aware of. One of them is for an insecticide, which is fairly recent. We haven't had that as long as we've had the other bulletin. The other bulletin was for the different dicamba over-the-top use products, and that is the second bulletin that you can see highlighted here. And if you're not familiar with how to navigate part of this website, if you look over on the left side, there is a listing under limitations for selected area. There's a listing for the 2 different pesticides that I'm referring to, the dicamba 2020, and then you see the insecticide there also underneath. And you can see that certain pesticides might be highlighted, and that's where you see a connection to areas that are outlined in yellow. And then if you go and select another pesticide that's under the listing, you can come up and have another area highlighted on the map. What you'd want to do is, if you are entering in your specific location, you want to make sure you print out the full bulletin so you can get all of the information and not just use a selected view that's on the website. So there is a button to print the whole bulletin. Again, as we go forward with Bulletins Live 2, this is something that's going to be more common practice. This is something that we're going to see a lot more of, and getting used to navigating this website and using it is going to be crucial. And what's interesting is that day is not too far off, not too far off. For a while, as we were looking at these different components of EPA's ESA strategy roll out into different types of mitigations, whether they're broad FIFRA IEMs or if they're ones that are specific to a species or a specific region of the US. We are seeing these start to come out on pesticide labels. Now, this is something that we've been waiting to actually see how it rolls out as part of registration of new actives and also registration review. We got to see a first look at how some of this might appear in January of 2024. Now, I do want to make the comment that this particular pesticide product is not one that went through the process that's outlined in one of the ESA strategies. This label came out in January of 2024, and the first strategy, the herbicide strategy, was not done until late 2024. So what was applied as part of this registration was slightly different. This product, again, did not originate from the herbicide strategies process, but the runoff restrictions were to avoid likelihood of jeopardy or reduce adverse modification of listed species in their critical habitat. And they were applied as part of a Section 7D consistency determination. So they did apply some of the components of ESA. And it's interesting, this is somewhat of an early look at what some of the mitigation measures were. Depending upon a pesticide user's hydrologic soil group, and you can see that over on the left side of the screen, there is a minimum number of credits that a pesticide user would need to achieve to manage runoff in order to use this pesticide in compliance with its label. And the table that you see on the right side is the listing of mitigation measures that are available, and you can see the corresponding number of credits. And this is where we start to see some of those conservation practices start to appear on pesticide labels. Now, there are options for pesticide users to pick from the mitigation measures and achieve their total credits and to try to meet that minimum credit requirement. But this is an early example, again, of some of those conservation practices starting to appear on pesticide labels, which has been a newer type of situation. Let's fast forward to just last month. We did see a pesticide label, a new active ingredient, be registered by EPA. And this is probably the first example of a pesticide label where we see the agency using the herbicide strategy. So this is the first one. This is the first one where we actually see what the herbicide strategy means as part of the pesticide registration decision. So when looking at this label, I did take out a couple of different subsections. And really, I do want to make a point that this is not the full label. The full label, I think, is it's over 30 pages. So if you do want to go through and read through the entire label, that's something that's going to take a lot longer than this webinar. But you can look at the different sections. I've highlighted a few here where we do start to see some of those FIFRA IEMs appear on the pesticide label. Under Section 11, there's a mandatory runoff mitigation component. You can see on here that there are requirements for visiting or accessing Bulletins Live 2 within 6 months of the application to determine whether your application site is falling into one of those pesticide use limitation areas. And if so, you need to get a copy of that bulletin to see if there are additional requirements. We were looking at the Bulletins Live 2 website and talked about that a little bit. This is applying geographic specific pesticide use restrictions. As you go down that section under mandatory runoff mitigation, you can see that there's also reference to EPA's mitigation menu website. Previously in the presentation, I showed a snapshot of that website where there are different mitigation options, and pesticide users can select an option using that calculator tool and accumulate how many total points their application site has to determine, do I have the minimum? Do I meet the minimum requirement for use of this pesticide? So that mitigation menu website is also referenced on here. And I think that's going to be something we see on future labels as well. So in looking at the mandatory runoff mitigation, we also see that there is a minimum of 3 points for the crop uses on the pesticide label. So what that says is that pesticide user to use this product needs to have at least 3 points. And there are different ways to achieve that. Again, there's variations under EPA's mitigation menu, but there are a couple of examples listed below on the label. So there are some of them provided, but it's good to note that going to these websites, looking at the options, looking at what's available is going to be a component of the use directions on pesticide labels going forward. Bulletins Live 2 and EPA's mitigation menu. If you look at Section 9, you can see that there are spray drift management requirements, and those are ones for pesticide use. And you can see that there are components that may not have been as visible on other pesticide labels previously, and some of them that you can find in some of the different pesticide strategies, the herbicide strategy, windbreaks, buffer requirements. Those are showing up on this pesticide label. So we do see the herbicide strategy coming out as part of this new label. So this is the first one. This is the first one that we see. So in looking at this first label, and this is for glufosinate P, I went to go see, well, gosh, does Iowa have a bulletin? Is there a bulletin to go along with this new pesticide label? And so I went to the Bulletins Live 2 website, and I admit, under the location search, I did put a pretty broad location. I didn't have a street address. Not a lot of fields actually have addresses. So I would encourage folks, if you're looking at using Bulletins Live 2, to work with the little bit. Make sure you're navigating to the right location, you've got the right information in, and ensure that you have done a thorough search to actually access a bulletin. There's also contact information if you do have any questions about Bulletins Live 2. You want to make sure that if there's a bulletin, you're able to access it. Long story short, when I went and kind of searched around in Iowa, I did not find one for this new herbicide. But I did notice when I was working on this that there are 2 PULAs that were identified, and that's over on the left side of the screen. Once I put in a location and I put in an EPA registration number and populate the product, I see under there it says 2 PULAs, and you know, just wanting to know where those were. Took a little bit of searching because even as I zoom out, it was not very clear at first where those 2 PULAs were located. But if you're interested, those 2 PULAs are located in the southeastern United States. Was able to find them. There's one that's close to Nashville. There's another one kind of close to the Alabama-Georgia state line. And one of them is really small, and it's really hard to find unless you really know where it is. So this is an example of where zooming in and actually a specific location, not a broad location, is important in order to make sure you're looking at whether or not there is a bulletin in that area. So this was one that was very interesting to look at how someone would navigate one of those. But you are able to find them on Bulletins Live 2. And what's interesting, I did pull up the limitations and what those pesticide use limitations are for those 2 different areas. And one of them, I thought it was interesting to know the limitation was do not apply within the use area between September 15 and May 15th, which was one of those locations. And then the other one was basically do not apply within the use limitation area. So this brings up another point in that these pesticide use limitation areas do have different directions. The mitigations that you see may not always be exactly the same. Just because you obtained a use limitation for a product in one location doesn't mean it's the same in another location. So always be sure to get your very specific geographic area identified in order to determine if you have one of these or not. So this was just another reminder that these are geographically specific, and that's what's coming out. Another thing that was very interesting in looking at these geographic specific areas is one of these locations did have multiple bulletins for different products. And by selecting the different product on the left side of the screen, you can see limitations for selected area. Underneath that, you can see highlighted there are limitations for dicamba 2020, but underneath that there are limitations for Enlist 2023 and glufosinate 2024. When you select these different bulletins, you want to make sure you're pulling up the correct one for the product that you're looking to use, and making sure you have the right one, because they are specific and they can be different use requirements. So this is something to be aware of if you're located in a site. If you are located within those areas that are outlined in yellow, there are several bulletins actually for that location. And you're going to have some additional use requirements. So this is a good example of one where the map has more than one bulletin and they're overlaying on each other. So that can happen as well. And going forward, that's something that I think will be looked at, and applicators are going to have to work on navigating. Many folks are going to have to work on navigating, because implementation of these strategies, again, the strategies do contain protection for species, listed species, that are important. It is important, and it's not reasonable, again, for species to have to wait. There are needs out there. These are issues that are specific to certain areas of the country, as I mentioned earlier on, they do hit home. With certain species and certain conservation efforts, they really are something to work towards. So implementation is important. As we move forward, there's quite a bit as it relates to implementing these strategies and making them move into some of the program areas in as smooth a transition as possible, making sure they're being implemented correctly, that they're effective, and that they work just at the end of the day. And how are we going to be doing that? I think it really does cover quite a range, quite a lot. And EPA is going to move forward with considering those impacts. Again, they're looking at doing this, going back to Endangered Species Act, with respect to those agency decisions. So that's the registration of new actives and re-registration process. That's going to continue. Those protective measures, those are something that we are going to see in multiple places. Hopefully, I've showed a couple of examples of where those frameworks outline certain protections, whether they're broad FIFRA IEMs that you're going to see on many different ag crop use labels, or if you're going to see very, very specific geographic mitigations coming from the bulletins. Those measures are going to be something that we need to access and identify early on, especially pesticide users. And that is something that I think is kind of where we're at now, is looking at ways to make these updates available to pesticide users and making sure that they're aware of these changes, these updates, these new requirements on pesticide labels. We do have one now. We have one that carries some of these requirements on them. And because it's on the label, that reminds us that compliance with the label goes along with the label is the law. These pesticides do have use directions, and if there are mandatory language, not just advisory, it's something that would be enforced. And it's the state lead agency that would be following up on that to ensure compliance. State lead agencies, I think it's important to note that we are still working through a lot of this information as well. The first label just came out last month. So state lead agency are looking at how to investigate, how to document, and how to ensure compliance with these requirements that we're seeing. So the enforceability component is also a big part of implementation. And you do see the state agencies starting to organize and look at those efforts. I can say that because I know that there was an effort to organize a compliance workshop attended by a variety of different state lead agencies back in September. And the topic was to look at compliance related to EPA ESA and implementation of those strategies. So this is something that is very current, being worked on right now. In addition to that, pesticide users, considering what changes there are going to be and the challenges pesticide users are going to have navigating these labels, and specifically determining what compliance looks like on a field by field basis and a product by product basis is absolutely crucial. There are multiple websites we're talking about navigating, and there's decision making. And some of those examples were provided in this presentation. So there are tools to use at this point in time. But I do think it's good to look at really how pesticide users are taking in that information. What are their questions? Are there challenges with meeting those requirements? And if so, trying to understand those. Are they able to access bulletins? Are they able to access up-to-date labeling? What are the questions related to some of these new types of mitigations we're seeing on pesticide labels? Are those mitigation measures implemented effectively at the field of application? If there are issues, where do the responsibilities lie? How does this apply when you have a situation where there's an applicator leasing a particular property or being hired to come in and don't have the ability to adjust practices at that site? what are the actions at that point? So again, I think looking at pesticide users and trying to understand really what are their challenges with implementation, that's going to be a real big component going forward. So that is also something that the state lead agencies are very interested in. I know other groups are looking at this too. And I do also want to acknowledge that EPA has attempted to provide some tools for pesticide users. They do have some of these tools on their mitigation menu website. We've already looked at the calculator. What I'm showing on this screen is really a flow chart that provides decision-making capabilities for pesticide users. So in order to comply with some of these new pesticide use requirements, this is the logic, the flow chart that has been provided, and this is taken from the final herbicide strategy. This is the flow chart. So in looking at this, I think it's going through it, it's a good exercise to better understand the decision making that's going to have to take place in order to meet those requirements and be compliant with pesticide labels going forward. So that somewhat brings me back around to the point where really where do we go from here? We've taken a look at broadly Endangered Species Act. What does it mean for federal agencies? What are some of the reasons, motivations for the different states, different entities that are located in regions looking to help support protections for listed species, realizing it's a shared problem, it's a shared issue, a shared topic, and looking at all of the work that the federal agency has put into coming up with strategies and where those are starting to be implemented. As far as where we can look for kind of the next documents, the next updates, registration actions. We've been talking about during this webinar new active ingredients as well as re-registration. EPA has a website where you can go and look for upcoming registration review actions. That is one way to get an idea of what's coming up next. There is a way to keep an eye out, register for certain notifications, looking at what agency actions are coming out next. So that is one way to stay in the know and be updated on what new labels will be coming up. That is one thing to watch for. Other areas where there are going to be updates, EPA's mitigation menu. That's one place where we've heard that there are still looking at the different options for mitigations. EPA is still looking at some of those and intends to continue updating that list once there is a new mitigation option that does meet the criteria, meets the standard, and EPA can post that on the website. So that is another area where we expect to see some updates. So that's another good one to keep an eye out for. In addition to that, one area where we're expecting updates is related to outreach and education. And EPA has put out some tools for pesticide users. We talked about the calculator, talked about a couple of the websites. There are also different videos on how to use Bulletins Live too. Those are education and outreach components, but we do expect more. We expect more to come about. And there are different contacts working on education and outreach related to ESA. And I have two that are listed here. And I would encourage folks listening to this, if you are interested in EPA, ESA outreach and education, connecting with your EPA regional office would be one way to start becoming better informed and getting an idea of what's going on. There are activities also at the headquarters level. And so there are ways to look at what information is coming out as it becomes available. More to come on that. I think that's an area where there's going to be a lot of activity. Even with all the different efforts and components of the strategies that I tried to just highlight today in the webinar, realize that there are more strategies to come. Again, there's an incredible amount of work, amount of time that's been spent already, but we do have finalized strategies that we're waiting to see. The final insecticide strategy is something we're looking forward to, as well as the draft fungicide strategy. So there are different strategy documents that have not yet been finalized. So that is also something to watch for. There's more to come. I do also want to point folks to EPA's Endangered Species website, where you can access a number of these different work plans, different components. A lot of the references I provided, you can access a lot of those materials through EPA's Endangered Species website. So there's a lot more to come. And I think in looking at all the different components of ESA, where we've seen see it play out in the pesticide regulatory space, one of the things that just comes to me is that there is an incredible amount of information, and to an extent, it's been pretty complex so far. So I think about, again, amount of information and complexity. There is an interest in simplifying or finding a way to deliver a lot of that information in an effective way, especially all the way down to the pesticide user level. And to me, that just, I think about, well, who does that and who's traditionally done that in the past? And that sounds a lot to me like work extension has done in the past. And I mention that from a standpoint, then that extension does have a history in bringing vital practical information to a variety of folks: ag producers, small business, consumers, families. We have a situation where there is this decision-making component. There's a lot of information related to managing crop production and applications in future pest management decisions that would be tied to this. And so there's a lot of opportunity at this point in time for anyone, not just extension, but other entities that are able to do that effectively and are looking for a challenge. So there's a lot more to come. There's a lot more to come. A lot of information is available on these different websites I provided. There are a lot of working committees, and there are a lot of groups that are still discussing ESA and also implementation of these strategies. One group I want to make sure folks are aware of is the working group that is organized by APCO. It's one of the groups I mentioned earlier, so the Association of American Pesticide Control Officials. They have a working group that's called SPIREG, and that's the State FIFRA Issues Research and Evaluation Group. The SPIREG working group has a structure which ensures there is representation from different regions across the country. So you do have a representative, no matter where you are in the US. There is also an opportunity for not just state lead agencies, but really this group encompasses states, tribes, and territories in the US. So it does cover the different regions, and there is representation. This is a group that continually discuss topics that have really a broad or a widespread significance. And they do look for ways to resolve those issues, address issues. They also have an opportunity to connect with EPA and seek assistance from that side. So there is that co-regulator component. And the reason why I bring this up is that this particular working group just formed a new committee, and it's an Endangered Species Implementation Committee. So if you're interested in what the states, tribes, and territories, what they're saying, their discussion, this ESI working committee is a place where a lot of those topics are going to be discussed, including implementation, a big focus on implementation. That's another opportunity. Also want to recognize that it's not just the regulator community that's talking about these issues. There's a lot of input that's being provided from other groups. Here's an example of a webinar that was just put on. It was on November 15th, so it's a recent one, and it is available on demand. So if folks are interested in that, you can go to the website and play it. But I do think it's good to acknowledge that there are a variety of efforts to look at ESA and EPA strategy documents and what these mean. Industry is very interested in doing this. And again, seeing these webinars provide evidence of that, and looking to ready pesticide users, also promote pesticide use and stewardship. I think this also offers some insight into really what some of the opportunities are to train and provide information to retailers, distributors, all the different entities that uh, have a role to play with respect to pesticide products and also pesticide use. I also want to acknowledge that there are some academic societies that have also taken quite a bit of interest in this topic, and they also have a lot of good information on their websites. This is a snapshot of Weed Science Society of America. You can see kind of toward the bottom of their website, they have a section on EPA's final herbicide strategy, what could change. It's just another example of groups that are looking at these strategies, anticipating really what's next, how to resolve some of these questions. It also, I think, captures really just the shared interest. Again, we're not just talking about one small group that is going to be impacted by this. Work on ESA and ensuring its implementation through these pesticide regulatory programs is a big component of ensuring success overall and maintaining utility of tools that a variety of groups need. Also, it's important for protection of the species, which I think, again, hits home to a lot of us. So very, very key and a lot of good information out there. So if you remember, just a little bit ago, I mentioned about this challenge that we have with the amount of information and the complexity of that information. Also, looking back to really how to get that information out and make it available in a way that's comprehended and one that can be implemented by pesticide users. That is something that, again, has been a real value from some of the different land grant institutions and extension groups in the past. And I guess the example that I think of, and this is just me speaking as an entomologist, because that was my training and background. I remember when I learned about economic injury level and economic threshold when I was going through school. And I remember thinking, gosh, seeing the tables and looking at what steps folks would have to go through and work through in order to make these decisions about whether or not to spray, when to spray, what they would need to survey and know before making some of those decisions and actually acting, making some of those pest management decisions. I thought, gosh, this is a real simplification of that the different areas of economics and insect ecology and pest pressure dynamics that it just brings in a format for decision making, and it was an answer, I think, to some of those challenges that were posed many years ago. And so I look at that example and I wonder, are there opportunities for doing that related to these ESA components and these different use requirements? Again, that there's a substantial need and it's a shared need by many different folks. So trying to take the knowledge that we have from all these different groups and move it through education and bringing it directly to people and creating that positive change. It just resonates with the land grant university system and some of the purposes of extension going forward. So I'm really excited in that. I can't wait to see what happens next. I look at just the span. I put the map up here just to look at the different areas of the country with some of these different entities, and I look at really what will emerge over the next couple of years. I know there are some different folks that work in specific areas of the U.S. that are looking at this right now. But I am curious really what the answer is for different cropping systems that are located across the country. Crop production practices and pest management decisions are not always the same. They're not uniform. So I really am interested to see really what emerges over the next couple of years in terms of what answer there is to this issue, to this challenge. And I also think that some of the best educators I've ever seen in action are ones that are working at the universities and in the extension programs. So there's a real value to that. You can't replace that. So that's always appreciated. So again, I am very interested to see where this goes. It has been a very busy couple of years, I know, for folks even working in the state pesticide programs, but I am excited to see what innovation, opportunities come up in the future, because I do think there is a place for that, and I look forward to it, really. So ESA is doing just that, presenting challenges, and we'll continue to work through that. And I believe those are the slides I have today. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'll go ahead and pause. I might have finished a little early here. I don't know, or a little late. Am I doing okay?
Yep, you're right on time.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so
And
we've got about 20 minutes that we can answer questions if you're ready to move that direction.
sure, I do also want to make a point that if we're not able to address all questions, here's my contact information, and also provide reference to those two different groups where I currently serve. So.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, Gretchen, thank you so much for sharing all this information today. I appreciate the level of detail you went into, the specific examples, and all of the useful links. So some people have asked, yes, this presentation is being recorded and will be available later. We will also be making an effort to share the links out as well. They are also in the chat today for the people that are still on. Okay, so a reminder, if you have questions, the Q&A is at the bottom, and we'll get started on those right now. Gretchen, can you address if there is any consideration to the value of the endangered species versus the value of the affected crop or use when making regulatory court decisions?
Hmm. So I'm going to answer, start answering that question with the disclaimer that I am not an attorney. So I don't know if I'm really the best person to answer a question about court decisions. Usually when I'm looking at some of those and trying to tease those out, it's on a court by court basis. So you're looking at the decision that the court provided in response to the issue at time. And it can vary. I have seen different things play out. If you follow the different litigation that has been going on the last couple of years, it involves different products, involves different basis in which individuals bring a suit. So sometimes I don't have a real good answer for you, unfortunately. I do think that there is an opportunity to bring the different viewpoints forward to the court. That is there. Now, really what determination the court's going to make, that's where we see some of those differences. And I do think it is important to see the process and really the strength of those actions that the federal agency takes. I think it's important to see that process come through and to have those science-based decisions. That is something that continues to come out. But as far as weighing the value, I do think that that's something that we see some differences in, quite honestly. But there is opportunity to bring different examples forward.
Yeah, thank you. That is a tough one. So this is an important question asked similarly by a couple people. Are there any resources for compliance for tech adverse people or people who do not have access to the internet, who do not use computers?
So for the Bulletins Live 2 website, I do know there's a phone number. It's a website that's maintained by EPA. So they do have contact information on that website. If there are issues related to Bulletins Live 2, that's where they would call and contact and direct those. If it's a website that is maintained by a registrant, and I bring this up because there are other labels that do direct applicators to a registrant's website. you're probably going to get the fastest answer by contacting the entity that maintains the website. And many times that's going to be listed there. For the mitigation menu, that would be one that EPA maintains as well, and you want to contact them if you're having technical difficulties with that. Another thing you can try, and I bring this up just because I know in Iowa this comes up, there are resources available within the state. Some of those might be contacting county extension offices. There's also retail dealers that might have information for you. And then there are also state offices. So there are places to go if there are technical issues. But ultimately, probably your fastest turnaround is going to be contacting the entity that actually maintains that site. You never know if the site is down for some reason. It can be a variety of issues and the reasons why it's not working.
Yeah, I think that'll be a challenge for some people. Hopefully we can use our networks to make sure that people get the information they need. Next question is, how will these new regulations be enforced on the applicator?
So that's a great question. The changes that this presentation was covering are really ones that are going to be covered on the pesticide label. So the starting point is really looking at the label and to see what's written on there. I mean, the label that's in the possession of the applicator is the one that is the starting point to look at. So that is something that we're going to have to look at how states enforce those pesticide labels going forward. And the first one is, as I mentioned earlier, that we've seen these strategies appear on is one that just came out last month. So it really is a newer question. What states have been discussing thus far, I can say that they have been meeting. I mentioned a compliance workshop in September. They are looking at different types of documents that might be relevant to determining whether or not someone is in compliance with this. That's a discussion point. So that also factors into discussion of record keeping. I believe one of the mitigation menu option is to keep copies of records. So that is an option as part of that menu. So part of this is going to depend on really what documents and records there are in these investigations and these compliance checks and inspections. Also looking at really what some of the issues are. I mean, a lot of times state agencies are responding to a tip or a complaint. They might also have some routine visits and there'll be a couple checkpoints there, but many times it's dependent on what is in that tip and complaint and what type of investigation develops as a result of that. So if it's a drift complaint, you might see a different type of investigation than if it's one related to runoff. So we're going to have to wait and see. Again, having the first label actually come out in October, I don't know if I can fully answer that question in November. We'll have to stay tuned. And that's where going to some of those discussion groups is probably a good idea to get a more thorough answer to your question.
Yep. Yep, it's coming for us. So a really similar question that also might be wait and see answer, but what will be the legal ramifications or financial disincentive that will lead to mitigation compliance? And who enforces the compliance?
So I can only really cover the state program aspect of that. I'm going to also give a disclaimer. I'm not going to be the best to answer other areas of the law that might be out, that there might be a better qualified person to address. But if it refers to the pesticide label and compliance there, you would want to look to your state agency as to what types of enforcement actions they have. And sometimes that can be outlined in state regulations. I can tell you just in Iowa, it can be something that might involve On the high end, it could involve a revocation, a suspension, civil penalty, a written notice, a warning, an advisory, to a dismissal. There are different types of enforcement actions that could take place. The fine, so a civil penalty or a fine, that's going to vary depending on the state and the incident, what type of violation, how egregious it is, and different factors as part of the incident in determining the amount. So there's no one amount. Again, I think it would be good if folks have questions, your best answer is going to come from your state agency and what actions they administer in the program.
Yep, that makes sense. How does the framework address record keeping and documentation of the mitigations used to reach the required point totals?
Well, that's a good question too. So there is no, at least I'm not aware of a uniform record keeping requirement based on the label at this point in time for the product that has implemented those strategies. We have seen examples of where certain products might have a record keeping requirement. I'm going to refer to the dicamba over-the-top use products. Those did have record keeping requirements as part of the label. There are also record keeping requirements related to state regulations, and those are going to be fairly standard for commercial applicators. And I would encourage, again, folks to, if you're in a different state than Iowa, definitely contact that state agency, and they should have more information on commercial applicator parts or components. USDA also manages private applicator record keeping requirements, and your state still would play a role in ensuring compliance, but the requirements are from USDA's program. So in short, some of the components of the label would be covered under current record keeping requirements. You might have a requirement on a label, on the current label, and in the strategies. I don't believe there is a specific requirement for documentation of the runoff and drift mitigation measures. EPA did put an option on the mitigation menu to add an additional point if record keeping was maintained, and that was something that I think it shows some effort to encourage record keeping of some of those practices.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Just a few more, I think easy ones, hopefully. Can you give an example of a strategy, I think a mitigation strategy, and how a farmer would implement it?
So a mitigation strategy, and gosh, I get to pick just any mitigation strategy. If you look at the listing, and I do want to start off by saying there are several options. It's not just one mitigation option. EPA has put forth efforts to provide flexibility to the applicator in making those decisions. And some of them are conservation practices, and those can include things like basically cover crops, vegetative filter strips. There's a long list. And I think one of the slides in this presentation is a better summary than what I'm referring to now. As far as drift goes, there's a variety of mitigation practices that involve windbreaks, looking at reduced application rates to the field. A lot of these things are practices that would be applied directly to the field. They may be adjustments that the applicator would make at the time of application. There are different points at which some of these options would be implemented. And what I think a better answer is going to be is to go and look at that menu and that listing and consider which one is best going to meet your particular site Because one thing that has been clear in discussions we've had in some of the state program circles is that one answer is just one answer. It's not going to be the answer for everybody. And I do think working with the experts in your area, whether they're tech service reps, they're extension specialists, or if you are struggling with that, to contact state agency. We can walk through some of those, talk about it. But this is where I'm going to come back around and say, I think this is where there's an opportunity for some assistance in decision making and making some of that information available and more straightforward. That's a place where I do think there's going to be some innovation coming, and look to some of that. So I know it's not a specific answer, but part of that is just because it really is on a field by field and product by product basis that you're going to find your answer.
Super. The next question is really specific, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this on the fly. So an extension professional, my Bulletins Live 2 only lets me search by EPA registration number, but she noticed that Gretchen has a product search option as well. Do you know if there's just a separate place you have to go to be able to search by product, or do we need an IT professional?
So the way that I have experience using the Bulletins Live 2 website is they really do. You find more flexibility if you go to the navigation, or if you go to the section on the left side, which identifies you want to type in your location, and then you want to put in the product, and putting in the EPA registration number really does help. So not typing in the full product name, because also you may not be able to find if you're trying to enter a trade name. It's going to be the product information that EPA is pre-populated in there. So the EPA registration number is really helpful. Once you enter that in, you'll see kind of a circle spinning next to the registration number, and it tells you that the system is looking up a match. Once you see it, select that product, and it will, the screen will readjust, and then you will have the option to click, so in the example that I showed, I had a location that had 3 different pulas in it. And so I was clicking on the products, and so I was within that product search window, and that's how I got that. It was not something that when I first went to the website, the box opened up for me. I hope
Sure.
that answers that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that helps. And just, there's a little bit of complexity to the website. So yeah, getting in there and poking around at it, coming up with questions, that's all good. Last one. Do you happen to know why EPA chose 6 months for Bulletins Live 2? So 6 months, I assume, between when they can print the bulletin and when they can apply.
I'm going to kick that question to EPA. I don't know the specific answer. I do know that there was an interest in providing enough time, to applicators, meaning that they didn't want it to be a short window. But I am not privy to the logic for the specific 6 months, unfortunately.
Okay, that is just fine. If I happen to get an answer to that question, we'll share it with the group who registered for the webinar today. So with that, thank you to everyone who stayed today for the duration of the webinar. Usually our Pest in Progress webinars are 30 minutes long, but today with this topic, we thought we'd need a little bit more time. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, January 15th at 12:30 p.m. Central, 1:30 Eastern. And the title will be Epidemiology and Measurement Using Tar Spot as a Model System, with a brief summary of tar spot inoculation experiments in semi-controlled environments. And the presenter will be Dr. C.D. Cruz from Purdue University. You can always find our upcoming webinars and subscribe to our newsletter on our website. And that's pretty much it. So thank you so much, Gretchen, for sharing your expertise with us today. I've heard this presentation and I still learned more things today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Bye.